I'm Frank Guridy, professor of history and African American and African diaspora studies here at Columbia. I'm also the executive director of the Eric H. Holder Jr. Initiative for Civil and Political Rights. Super excited to be here tonight to talk about what transpired and is still transpiring with respect to the midterm elections. This is the second installment of the American Voter Project of this year. We were here about a month ago to talk about Eric Holder's new book and the long struggle for voting rights. And now we're here tonight to talk about the midterms. So for those of you who don't know, the Eric Holder Initiative was created in 2017. It aims to inspire our undergraduate students to draw upon their superior liberal arts education that they get here at Columbia to do impactful political work while they're here and afterwards. Through the creation of timely and innovative programming, a justice-oriented curriculum, the Holder Initiative aims to cultivate a broad conception of justice, right? One that seeks to empower you students to address the many challenges of our time. I'm delighted to be here with you tonight, and I want to welcome you to this, again, the second event of this year. I want to thank Beth Manchester, our Senior Associate Director, for putting this event together, for herding us, and bringing us, and making sure we could get here together to have this wonderful conversation. And I want to thank you all for coming as we barrel towards the end of the semester, towards Thanksgiving, and then before we know it, we're in finals. So we appreciate you coming to take the time to reflect on and discuss the politics of our time. The panel is a reconvening of sorts. Some of us were part of the Holder Initiative panel that was looking forward to the midterm elections. And I wasn't yet the executive director, but I was in the audience that day, and I had this feeling. I remember saying to myself, gee, I want to talk to these people. And so here I am moderating this discussion about the elections that just passed. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. I'm going to keep the introductions short. All their accomplishments are noted in the program. They are well known. So I'll just highlight a few things about them, and then we'll proceed with our discussion. I will start, of course, by introducing Eric Holder, the namesake of this initiative. He was, of course, the 82nd Attorney General of the United States. Among the projects he's been working on after his tenure as Attorney General has been the work he's been doing as the chairman of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, an organization that seeks to combat gerrymandering by fighting to create fair electoral maps throughout the country. He, of course, is a favorite son of Columbia, being an alum both of the college and of the law school. After Eric, I will introduce Leah Aden, who has served as Deputy Director of Litigation at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, LDF, since October 2018, assisting in the planning, strategy, and supervision of LDF's voting rights work. In light of the post-census redistricting cycle, Leah is leading the planning, strategy, and supervision of LDF's redistricting efforts for state and local bodies in Alabama, Louisiana, South Carolina, as well as other jurisdictions. Since joining LDF in 2012, she's also had an active civil rights attorney docket using litigation, policy, public education strategies to ensure that Black people have equal access to the political process, economic opportunity, and environmental justice. She's also a Columbia College alum, and we're really excited to have her back here. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you.
Next panelist is Cornell Belcher, who is the president of Brilliant Corners Research and Strategies, a political strategist, and he's a writer. He's one of the premier strategists in national progressive politics, as well as the rebranding of corporate America. He's a current political contributor for MSNBC. He's also a former political contributor to CNN, having provided political analysis to them for 6 years. He served as a pollster for the Democratic National Committee under Chairman Howard Dean, making him the first minority to lead in that role for either national party. He served on the polling team for both Obama presidential campaigns. And over the years, Cornell has worked with both Senate and House Democrats as a senior political advisor to the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee in the 2002 cycle and special projects director for the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee in the 2000 cycle. And Cornell has also served for Women Vote, coordinator of Emily's List in the 1998 cycle, helping to put together communication and GOTV operations targeting women voters all over the country. Welcome, Cornell. Thank you so much for joining us. Next panelist is María Teresa Kumar, who is the founding president of Voto Latino, a grassroots political organization focused on educating and empowering a new generation of Latinx voters, as well as creating a more robust and inclusive democracy. She's an American activist and social entrepreneur and an Emmy-nominated MSNBC contributor seeking to shake up the political process. Leveraging youth, technology, social platforms, and influencers, Voto Latino reaches 6.5 million monthly. Voto Latino is a key civic engagement organization registering 500,000 plus voters. Kumar also serves on the boards of Emily's List and the World Economic Forum's Global Shapers. María Teresa, welcome back to Columbia.
Great.
Last but certainly not least is Professor Gregory Wawro, who's professor of political science here at Columbia University. He specializes in American politics, including Congress, elections, campaign finance, judicial politics, and political economy, and political methodology. He's the author of the book Legislative Entrepreneurship in the United States, House of Representatives, and he's the co-author of Filibuster, Obstruction, and Lawmaking in the United States Senate, which is a historical analysis of the causes and consequences of filibusters. He's published many articles in many well-renowned political science and social science journals, and we're really excited to have him back here with us tonight. Welcome, Professor Wawro. All right. I am so eager to get started, so let's get into it. So the format is straightforward. I'm going to pose some difficult questions that I'm sure these folks have not thought about before as their answers. I say jokingly, that's not the case at all. They will respond, we will have a conversation, and then we'll turn it over to you for questions and for a question and answer period. Sound good? Okay, let's do it. Here's question one. You ready? What happened to the red wave, or was it the red tsunami, or was it the red hurricane, right? Was this narrative, of a red wave, fears, a product of just Fox News inspired media hype that inflated fears of a Republican takeover of the Senate and the House, or was there something there that people just misread, right? So that's the obvious question that people have been discussing. So I figured this is a group of people who have answers to that question. So I'll start with you, Eric. Tell us about the red wave that didn't happen.
Okay. It'll be interesting to hear what everybody has to say. At the NDRC, the National Democratic Redistricting Committee that I'm the chairman of, we do our own polling, and we also look at other polls. And the polling that we were doing, and especially looking at the early vote total, was inconsistent with the notion that there was going to be a red wave. But I got to tell you, I heard it so much that I kept thinking, well, even though there's huge numbers of young people voting, even though there's huge numbers of Democrats have already voted as opposed to Republicans, there still must be something going on here, because I got sucked into the notion that there was going to be this red wave. Again, let's hear what my fellow panelists have to say, but I think at least a part of it had to do with there's the Fox narrative and the conservative media, narrative. That then gets aided by...
You're the best.
Mike's picking up everything.
Mike is always hot.
They're passing notes over here.
But it also got aided by some polling done by less, I think now, maybe less than reputable, but validated by the mainstream media that said, Maggie Hassan's is going to have a tough race. And we were looking at stuff and kind of like, this guy's not getting that close. But and Maggie Hassan's good, she's the senator in New Hampshire. And then see that repeated in other parts of the country. So I think it was a combination of maybe the media stuff, the polling stuff, and then Democrats, progressives, we tend to be just pessimistic, So I kind of bought into it. Even though people in my organization were telling me, this is not going to be as bad as people, are saying.
And of course, there's a historic pattern, right, of the midterms not being good for the party in the White House.
Right. Having lived through the shellacking in 2010 in the Obama years, I was prepared to do a lot of drinking.
Yeah, a lot of us were. María Teresa, what's your sense of the red wave that didn't happen?
So first of all, I just want to just clarify. Voto Latino, actually, to date, we've registered 1.2 million individual voters in 8 battleground states. In 2020, we registered 650,000. close to 60% of them were first-time voters and disproportionately female. In this past election, we didn't get as close because people didn't believe that Latinos were actually voting on the Democratic Progressive side. And I think this is where here lies the rub. I think one of the challenges we have to recognize is that there is a very clear strategy from an opposing party to create a narrative around this idea that, in this case, young people and Democrats weren't going to go out. Why? Because psychologically, it depresses the vote. If you think that your vote doesn't count, you're not going to go out. And so we started looking at poll numbers very early on, and we're saying, look, yes, the vote could seem split if it's Democrat versus Republican today, but the moment that you add a MAGA Republican versus a Democrat, nobody wants part of that brand except a very sliver of America. And what I think we're going to end up seeing is that a lot of independent voters either voted Democratic or they didn't want to vote for the Democrat. They ended up staying home. And it was interesting because we started seeing these false narratives coming out first on the Latino community. I will never forget, it was a Wall Street Journal poll that came out last December. And you guys are in school. How many of you folks are taking statistics? Okay, so this is for you. So this poll read, headline, Latinos, if you voted today, would vote Trump, Biden evenly. Okay, I said, that's curious because that's not what my work is showing me. And this poll, get this, it was 162 Latino surnames with a margin of error of 7.6 plus or minus. That's malpractice. So I called the Democratic pollster, and he's like, oh, you know what, this should help you. I said, this isn't gonna help me. And I said, well, who did you do it with? Again, the Wall Street Journal. He's like, oh, my partner in this was a Republican pollster. He was a Trump pollster. The next thing we know, everybody's talking about how Latinos are defecting to the Republican Party. And that was, again, I've been doing this for a very long time, 18 years, do the math, had never in my experience. I said, Florida's gonna be very different. And they're like, well, what about Myra Flores down in southern Texas? I said, that's a heavily gerrymandered district that did not exist when Biden ran for Texas. And sure enough, if you look at the map, Beto got all of the ruby blue except for the ruby red of a redistricted Republican map. What happened as a result of those polls? People didn't want to invest in the Latino community. They didn't want to invest in young people because they were saying young people weren't going to come out. And what you all proved was, your generation absolutely proved the opposite. That you guys actually have a very fundamental understanding of what's going on. And my whole thing, what I kept telling my team is, don't believe the polls.
You should believe the polls.
As a pollster, I'm so sorry.
No, that's fine. But we should, let's level set a couple things. Yeah. It's interesting that you brought up that Wall Street Journal point, because about 2 weeks ago, I got a text, and I was actually looking for the text from a reporter, I think it was a reporter at Politico, telling me about how a Wall Street Journal poll said African Americans were leaving the Democrats to go for the Republicans. And and she wanted me to talk about it, and I text her back, LOL. And no, I'm not talking to you about this. So let's put a pin in that because I'm going to come back around to it. First, thank you for having me here.
Yes,
I appreciate the invitation. It's an esteemed group I'm here with at a university. I love when I come back to universities and I lecture and I'm doing panels at universities that literally would not have let me in when I was applying for. So thank you. But let's level set for a moment. One is the understanding, you all started this earlier, and as someone who was ringside for 2010 also, where we lost 63 seats. We need to understand sort of contextually what tends to happen and how there really are two electorates fighting for control of America. If you go to, and a lot of it is sort of seen in turnout. So if you go to 2010, look at 2010 and 2014. Both midterm elections were where our guy, and again, I'm not going to be partisan tonight, but Obama, the Democrats didn't do too well. What was happening in that electorate? You had between 41 and 37% of eligible voters turning out. And if you go back over the last 2 decades, you've had somewhere in the range of 43 to 37% turnout. In 2012, it was 37% turnout. So you are having a very narrow swath of America lean in and decide which direction they want to go. What I always tell people is, you know, we had this big election in 2008 where 11% of the voters were people who had not participated before, and that the guy that he worked for made sure that we built a campaign to actually increase turnout and make the electorate look more like America. Going into this process, one of my first meetings at a very small table with then Senator Obama, he talked about building a movement. We weren't going to build a campaign, we were going to build a movement where we had to understand that if we had John Kerry's electorate, we were probably not going to win a general election, and quite frankly, if we didn't bring more young people and more diversity into the primary process, we didn't have a chance. So we focused on bringing in new people and making the electorate look more like the voters. So 11% of those voters were new voters, and they were disproportionately younger. And guess what? Your generation of Americans are the most diverse generations of Americans ever. So you all have to get this shit right, or there's going to be a real problem in the future with questions of diversity. So 2008, you had this huge turnout, and you had Democrats winning all across the country. It wasn't like 2010, those people said, you know what, we made a mistake. I actually don't like that AG, he's terrible. And we're gonna go the opposite direction. That's not what happened. It was a pullback. So you go from 60% turnout to 40% turnout. And what happens? You have an older, less diverse, more conservative electorate and so you really do have two tug of wars happening. We thought this would, so if you go back and look at the last 6 or 7 midterms, this has been fairly consistent except for one. You want to guess which one that wasn't? 2018, right, I know you know all the answers. It was 2018 where we had a midterm electorate that looked almost like a presidential electorate, where you had close to 50% of voters turning out. I argued going in that this wasn't going to be a wave election because of the things that the AG was talking about, he was seeing. The greater the proportion of eligible voters are turning out, just looking at demographically, the less likely it is for Republicans to be able to garner a wave election, because demographically they are locked in and they're not expanding demographically. And what tends to happen in a midterm is, I'm getting in the weeds, but you're all smart kids. If you look at 65 plus performing Dem precincts versus 65 plus performing Republican precincts, 2014, 2010, what do you have? You have 14% turnout difference between those high-performing Republican precincts and those high-performing Democrat precincts. Now, I don't care how great a candidate you are, I don't care how much money you have, if there's a 14-point difference between base Republican precincts and base Dem precincts, you're gonna get your hat handed to you. So that is the context for why we were thinking there was gonna be a wave election, or people thinking that 2018 was an outlier and that this election was going to reverse and look more like 2014, 2010. Now, which in the data was showing why I went on television and said this is not going to be a Republican wave election because the turnout is going to be dramatically different. Now, the narrative, going back to Wall Street Journal. What you saw over a 2-3 week period is a flooding of the zone. And it was a conscious flood, and I wasn't the only one talking about this. A conscious flooding of the zone, it looked to us, by Republican pollsters with skewed universes. Your poll is as good as your universe, right? Good poll, and you poor statistical students, I'm sorry. But polling is just as much of an art as a science. In fact, the science part is the easy part. Hell, a book will teach you how to get the science part. The art part is different. And so your universe, who you are assuming going to be your universe, dictates how straight on that poll is. Going into 2012, AG, you might remember that Republicans were going into Pennsylvania and they were going into Minnesota and spending money, and the Romney campaign was making all these swings. We were like, what the hell are they doing? What are they seeing? Right. And the Romney campaign literally didn't think they were going to win that election. And side note, so at the time I was doing corporate work with some of the Romney people. They really did think they were going to win that election. And part of it was they didn't think, AG, that we were going to get, that Obama was going to generate that same sort of enthusiasm. Mm-hmm. They thought they were going to have I almost forgot his name, your guy John Kerry. They thought they were going to have the Kerry-Bush electorate again, and we knew they were going to have that electorate again. So that's part of the issue with polling is, in fact, it is your universe of people that you think are going to turn out. Now, something that's happening in polling, and I'll say this as the pollster, and I'm going to get off it and I'm going to move on. We are using polls now to drive narrative and create narrative. And I sat on Meet the Press about 2 weeks ago, and everyone was saying it was wave, 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 and I said, I think we are creating a narrative around a wave more so than it is in the data. And what's happening now with polling is they are using polling to do things that polling was never intended to do. One, polls are not a crystal ball. I know we all want to know the future, but and Professor could probably tell you even bit more than so than I. No, polls weren't created to give you a horse race. They were not created to give you a horse race. There's so much more richness in the data of a poll. Polls are a tool. If you're using polls as a tool to understand where your electorate is and how to move your electorate, that's one thing. But now we're using polls for competition. And the media, which she and I are both a part of now, I think we're abusing it in a way where now the poll becomes the story, as opposed to issues becoming the story. And we're driving narratives, and we're trying to use fundraisers, building fundraisers saying our candidate is in a toss-up race in X, Y, or Z state, so give us money. So to a certain extent, we are now abusing and using polls in a way that it was never intended to be, and for our own political purposes.
Yeah, that's a really astute observations. Like so that you're seeing that you're arguing, right, that this notion that the polls are designed to generate narrative now, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Far too often, especially the public polls. Like her poll, most of her polling you're going to do, and his poll, you're never going to see it,
right?
Because they're strategic documents.
Right.
Now, were there polls used or created to drive that narrative? I mean, are some, are there, I don't know, the Acme poll that Fox was using or saying, is it, I'm just making up a name here, but were some of those polls or polling organizations created to drive the narrative that aren't necessarily neutral?
I think the Wall Street Journal poll that they did on the Latino vote was absolutely that. And this is where I think diversity in media is really important. Had there been Latino folks with Latino sensibilities in mainstream media making these decisions, they would have looked at that poll and said, no way. But instead what happened is that you have individuals in the executive making decisions, and they themselves hold these tropes of how Latinos should be, right? How many folks, we had to basically constantly talk about how Latinos' second issue when it came to polling, came to voting, was abortion. No way, no, but it is. And no other way that you could dice it. And why? Because this is an interesting fact, and I shared it last time. The majority of whites are 58 years old when you do like the most common age number, right? The majority of African Americans is roughly 43, 44. The majority of Latinos are 11 years old, if you were to plot it on a plot graph. That means that they have mommies that are 26, 27 years old, and all of a sudden you're going to take away their access to health care? Yeah. You got to be kidding me.
Mm-hmm. So. Leah, from your perspective, where was your head coming into election night, and what was your read on things, and as the election night approached?
I will put myself in the camp of the pessimist. Yeah. And this is a little bit outside of my expertise, but I would say it was a confluence of a lot of things to avoid us going over the edge of a cliff that I think people very much see is ahead of us. And I think we are not out of the woods with the presidential election coming up. I think people, because of litigation, trying to increase avenues of opportunity to vote, whether that's absentee voting or expanded early voting or automatic voter registration. I've been working for years to provide mechanisms, as many mechanisms as possible for people to be able to access the ballot. I think there have been we're slow in changing some of the big structural things, like the flawed redistricting maps that really lock in power, the issues with our popular vote. All of those structures have not been addressed, but I think that other avenues of access to the ballot people have been pushing for over many decades. And I think that litigation leading up to this election mattered. I think that policy mattered. I think people wanting police reform, people wanting access to health care, people seeing what is happening to our ownership over our own bodies, people knowing that at a certain point, we're not going to be able to put the genie back in the bottle if we don't have different representation. And I think people are, because of social media, because of lots of different things, and because of organizing, are more aware of what is at stake and came out despite all of the obstacles. And I think we cannot undersell the organizing that has been done, the many touches that our grassroots organizations have been doing with voters to increase more people of color feeling invested than their vote, and that their vote can actually change outcomes, that young people understand the connection between voting and policy issues, access to student loan forgiveness, and all the other things that are really at the forefront of our lives. I think it was the confluence of a lot of things, but I want to note that we are so far out, not out of the woods. We have so many fish to fry, and I think we have just pulled ourselves back from going, in a direction that I think will be really hard pressed to get out of without many decades of work. In short, I think it's all of the answers here, and I think it's more in the confluence, and we made it out of the woods a little bit, but we have just a long way to go to address the problems that compelled people to participate in this midterm election.
Thank you for saying that last point, right? I mean, I think all of us on this, I'm going to presume that all of us on this panel know that we're not out of the woods yet, and that we're not doing a victory lap here, right? And we can talk about what went right, and I want to talk about that next, but I also want to hear from Professor Wawro.
So I'll give you the boring social scientist answer, which is we have lots of interesting hypotheses, but lots of data yet to be analyzed. There's survey data, exit poll data is not available yet, and so I want to see at a minimum crosstabs of some of these different factors. So some of the interesting hypotheses are Donald Trump fatigue, or Donald Trump endorsing poor quality candidates. There's the Dobbs decision, which we talked about in the spring. It hadn't come down yet, but the opinion had been leaked, and we speculated about how huge that could be. The January 6th election denialism, worries about overthrowing democracy. That's putting a lot of faith in voters that they can say, like, oh, inflation is out of control, but I really care about American democracy, and so I'm going to vote that way. So lots of interesting hypotheses. The one that I'd like the most at this point, given what I've seen and how I've thought about this, I think it's consistent with what Cornell was saying, is the red wave already happened. It happened in 2020. It did. Because if you look at the toss-up races in the House during that election, they all went Republican. I mean, every single one went for the Republican candidate. And so, back up a little to 2018, that was the blue wave or blue NAMI, or however you want to describe it, where Democrats picked up every toss-up seat in the House and even made inroads into seats that were considered to be leaning or safe Republican. And so I've come to think more about and accept more this pendulum theory of American politics, about how we're swinging back and forth. Like, so 2010, there was a shellacking, but if you look at what happened in 2006 and 2008, the Democrats ran the table in those elections. We got to a supermajority in the Senate with the Democrats, like something that's unheard of. And so the 2010 was basically, in my view, a lot of just backlash of Democrats winning in places where they don't normally win, and voters kind of saying, well, I'm going to go back to the other party. And so I think the hypothesis that I'm most enamored with at the moment is that basically in 2020 the Democrats gave back over half of the seats that they gained in 2018. That is seats that they gained in traditionally Republican territory, they gave back in the 2020 election. So a lot of the focus is at the presidential level. But if you look at the data, the Republicans did incredibly well at the House level. And so in 2022, where were they going to pick up seats? It's complicated by redistricting, because the candidates that ran in 2020 weren't running in the same districts for the most part in 2022. But in my view, there wasn't much, the sort of red wave that swept a lot of Republicans into office in 2020 had receded, and there wasn't much, the next wave to come up, there wasn't, I guess the beach was a little higher. I'm not quite sure what the appropriate metaphor is, but it was going to be harder for Republicans to win in those seats. So I think I'm really curious to, once we get better data becomes available, to see, how much did Dobbs matter? How much did the economy not matter, right? Inflation has generally, historically not been a great predictor of election outcomes. Yes. It's GDP growth that appears to be a better predictor. The quality of candidates, like all this stuff is in, we have data on this.
Except Georgia.
Except Georgia, right, yeah, so we'll see, but that's, so my take is, lots of interesting hypotheses, and I think, lots of things to look at the margins, how much they made a difference.
Actually, I will take Georgia, and this is why I'll take Georgia. Someone asked me, is this Georgia, and lots of progressives go, how could that race even be close? I was going to say Donald Trump got 49% there. And what's the difference between Donald Trump and Herschel Walker? Except for one is black. And one is so I always knew that race was going to be close. And you know why it's going to be close? Because a Democrat can't get above 31% of the white vote in Georgia. And so is he going to get he's going to win the overwhelming majority of white vote in Georgia. And quite frankly, there's actually a fairly consistent voting pattern that's fairly locked in since LBJ signed the civil rights legislation. I was in Paris when I found out America was post-racial after 2008, AG. Because all the Parisians would come up and say, congratulations, you elected a black person, America's post-racial, right? Right?
Coming from Parisians?
Yeah, of course. But if you look at that election, what was the percentage of the white vote that John Kerry got? John Kerry got 43% of the white vote. What was the percentage of the white vote that Barack Obama got in his post-racial amazing 2008 election? It was around 43%, right? It was a breakthrough, but it wasn't a breakthrough that most people wanted to talk about. It was a demographic breakthrough. What's the difference between John Kerry and Barack Obama? About 4 or 5 more million brown people and young people, right? That's the breakthrough that's happening here. So no, I knew Herschel Walker was gonna do well because I knew he wasn't gonna dramatically do worse than Donald Trump did, because I knew, again, 65+% of the white vote was gonna go there. And by the way, look, I don't want to be a fly in the ointment here, in the milk here, but folks, we are not post-racial. We are as racially polarized now as we are at any moment, at least politically, that I can remember. And I'm not kidding you. You all have to get this stuff right, because if we keep going along this division, America's not going to make it, right? Because we are becoming even more racially polarized. The governor candidate in Arizona, who just barely lost, we're not out of the woods, 49.6%? She's out campaigning with known white nationalists. She's out campaigning with people who are talking about the racial war. She was out campaigning with people who are putting forth this ideal of replacement theory, right? So for me, this is what this polarization really, the original sin of America keeps coming back to haunt us, and you all have to fix it. Sorry.
No pressure.
No,
No pressure.
240 years, it's all on you guys.
Cornell, in line of what you're saying, this leads to my next question. Which is essentially, what did the Democrats do right? How did they withstand this historic pattern of the party in the White House not taking a beating in a midterm election, right? Even though there's these other things that Greg, you alluded to that leads one to think that the red wave would not happen in this particular midterm. There was a piece in the New York Times by Trip Gabriel. We have read this piece before. It's a piece that makes my skin crawl, but I'm going to refer to it. And it's trying to explain, an early explanation for why John Fetterman did well and won in Pennsylvania, right? Because he won the white working class voter, right? And the search for the white working class voter, or the Trumpite, the white working class, white Trumpite, right? Which was the sort of undecided voter of previous elections from, earlier in the pre-Trump era. That's one explanation, right? That it was about Fetterman's sort of presentation as an everyman, white working class
But he
man.
didn't win the white working class.
Right. Okay. Right. But so that's okay. So I'm setting us up for that discussion, right? So part of the question here is about what I mean, and that does mean going into these specific races, which have their own sort of local configuration that lead to the outcomes they did. But I mean, let's talk about what Democratic candidates did right, or is it just simply that people just ran away from Trumpite MAGA folks?
I'll say something at the 30,000 foot level, then I'll throw it back. Okay, take a word cloud. In this word cloud for this election, the big pieces of the big words in the word cloud were inflation, abortion rights, crime, democracy. Those were the dominant in the word cloud. Take democracy and choice out of that word cloud, and Democrats were getting their asses kicked. This ideal that, and this, my job as and I'm a campaign hack, right? This is what I do for a living. My job is to dictate what a campaign's gonna be about. He or she who defines the terms of a debate, they're gonna win that debate. And Bush was someone who defied history after 9/11. And Nicole Wallace talks about how people forget, you all may not have even been born. Most people forget that the economy was beginning to tank on Bush's first term as well. Did Bush talk about the economy?
Yeah, the war.
He talked about the war. He defined what the debate was going to be about. It would have been asinine for Democrats to have just talked about inflation and the economy, because that would have been the Republicans' turf, right? Our job as a campaign is to cross pressure. The president used his bully pulpit, his horn, to push the ideal of threats to democracy, well, there really are threats to democracy, into the conversation. And Dobbs was a huge motivator. It really was. When you look at those young voters who turned out, and hell, even in our data going into the election, what was one of them, when we asked them what was the number one motivator, it was about choice. You take choice and threats to democracy out of that word cloud, and I think you do have 2014 and an electorate that looks more like 2010 again. But again, our job is to try to force the terms of the debate. And I'm not putting a value judgment on that, but yes, doing independent experiential work for the DCCC, almost every ad we did was about choice, and almost every ad the campaign was doing was actually about defining themselves from an economic standpoint. So we actually did talk about the economy, but yes, we forced choice as an issue because we knew that was an issue that was going to cross-pressure voters and help us.
It's interesting because some of the polls were saying, oh, Democrats are going too far, abortion's not going to be as big an issue as they say. That Biden was dumb to give the speech on democracy. I saw some Democrats, saying that they should have been talking about the economy, and yet I think democracy, choice were certainly things that motivated people. But I also think there were some structural changes that have helped. Now I'm kind of beating my own drum here. I mean, our work on redistricting to try to make it more fair in states, and we succeeded in some states. We're still, litigating in others. Michigan had unbelievably gerrymandered maps from the 2011 cycle. They put in place an independent commission to draw the lines. So you end up having districts that are basically kind of fair. And what happened? The state flips. Focusing on state-level candidates, not only thinking about what's going on in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. More support for those folks. I think that helped as well. But I think we Democrats were successful. I mean, New York Times looked at all the districts and said 75% of them can be considered fair. My theory is if the districts are fair, Democrats and progressives will do just fine. That also meant that 25% were unfair, and given where we are in the House of Representatives, that 25% unfair number for districting is probably the difference between Republicans or Democrats controlling the House of Representatives. You see what DeSantis did in Florida with regard to redistricting, Texas, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana,
South Carolina,
Arkansas,
Mississippi.
Right. There's the, you whistle Dixie as you're saying these things. But all those places have partisan and racial gerrymanders in place that, so the structure wasn't changed there. But I think the structure was sufficiently changed such that in addition to everything else, it made it easier for Democrats to do well.
Other thoughts about what Democrats did right?
Well, I just want to jump on the bandwagon a little bit and just focus, because we've talked about the Michigans and the Pennsylvanias, Georgias in the Deep South, but I do want to note that in Texas and Florida and South Carolina, Mississippi, some of the places of our country that have the most black voters, there's still just oppression, and we have not changed the structures that will allow those communities to have better representation, and I think that is what worries me going into, it's literally a microcosm of, you talk about this country that's becoming more demographically diverse, that is becoming, younger people are moving the narrative of our country forward, but you also have places where right now black voters are close to the majority, or Latino voters are close to the majority in these states, and you would never know that by the racial makeup and the policy makeup of both the federal structure and the state structure. And I think we have serious concerns going into this next wave of presidential elections and everything that comes after it, when those places are not changing at the pace that other parts of the country are changing. People are still existing under very oppressive regimes in Florida, right, where you mentioned a governor who both rigged the maps, but also I think the last time I was here in 2017, it was just before the Amendment 4 enfranchised more than 1 million people with felony convictions, and the state has done everything to pull those returning citizens back into second-class citizenship, right? And what that means in terms of healthcare, justice, and other forms of access in that state, those have not changed, and so I'm interested in our successes, but I'm worried about how those successes trickle down in those places where the structures at every level of government are much more reminiscent of where we were in the 60s. And we have not, I don't know what the solution is in order to access them.
I think that
We're suing, but we have a Supreme Court that, right, we improved the structures in Alabama, we improved the structures in Louisiana, and then the Supreme Court, because we lost those seats, is now putting a pause, even when courts are coming to the rescue at the state and federal level. The Supreme Court is in the way of having access, right? And what do we do about that?
I mean, you think about it. I mean, just one quick example. I mean, Alabama, lawsuits are brought to challenge the way in which the congressional delegation is constructed in Alabama. 27% of the folks in Alabama are African American. 3-judge panel down there, including 2 Trump-appointed federal judges, say, you know what? That violates Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. You need to redraw the lines such that African Americans have the opportunity to select a person of their choice. There's a history of racially polarized voting in Alabama. All right, so that's fine. We're going to get new lines in Alabama. This is great. Supreme Court says, well, too close to the election. We're going to say that, you're too close to the election, so therefore you can't put in place these changes that this 3-judge panel has said. We're going to make you run on the old lines that this 3-judge panel, including 2 Trump judges, have said or violate the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Now, this is 9 months before the election, 2-3 months before the primary, and so they say, all right, we'll take. So that case is now before the Supreme Court, and I fear it's going to be used as the vehicle to really get at Section 2 of the the Voting Rights Act.
But that happened in Georgia, that happened in Louisiana, that's
right.
happening in Texas. I mean,
But I think before we go, I think, when you were asking what have the Democrats done, the biggest challenge that we have at Voto Latino is to convince people that their vote worked. And there are receipts that by turning out in record number in 2020, we actually have something to show for. We had the very first time that we passed in 35 years some type of gun reform. Is it over? No. But that's because young people showed up. There's student debt that was relief. Why? Because young people showed up. Is it done? No. And we could put a pin on it. For the very first time, we have $500 billion dedicated to some sort of climate relief. That's because young people came out and said, this is an issue. So when people say my vote doesn't matter, it's like, no, we actually have receipts. You were talking about this idea of, the polling. One of the biggest challenges I think that happens with a lot of pollsters is that they have a tendency of going to voters that have voted in the past. We're talking about 4 million young people that turned 18 since the last election just 2 years ago. They never get asked. In 2020, you guys didn't get asked. You're also not going to get asked in the next one. One of the biggest challenges we had was in 2020, 51% of Latinos who voted for Biden, 51% were either first-time voters or low-propensity voters. Guess who doesn't get a call? First-time voters and low-propensity voters. I was meeting with Steve Ricchetti at the White House 3 weeks before this past election. I said, Steve, the youth Latino vote in Arizona and in Nevada are down. And if they are at 2014 levels, where only 11% showed up because they were the vote share, we're in trouble. And he's like, well, young Latinos don't show up. I'm like, well, you know what we did? We had $4 million to go out into our 8 battleground states. And I told my team, I said, you know where we're redirecting that money? To Nevada and Arizona, because up to 3 weeks before the election, polls were telling us that 43% of Latinos had not received a phone call. Who? Young voters, low propensity voters. And that is one of the things that we have to reimagine on how we do outreach to young people and just in the Democratic Party. The Republicans are fine going to their high propensity voters, but the Democratic base is young, low propensity voters, communities of color. And the work that is happening in Georgia is huge. We are seeing in the next, one of the things that we're going to see in the next Warnock runoff was that 30% of the people that voted for Warnock in the Latino community were between the ages of 18 and 29. 30%. And the only reason that we're having conversations of whether or not we're going to have this thriving democracy is everything the work that you're doing. It's all about who has access to the voting booth. Thanks to Eric at Voto Latino, we are actually right now doing these, we're actually contesting redistricting in Texas. Right. And we also have two other lawsuits. Why? Because one of the lawsuits, and every single American should get so pissed off at this, excuse my language, is like, because in Texas right now, I can't go and do my work and register young voters on college campus because you would illegally be actually registering on college campus because it's a temporary address. But unless you're physically in your home that you would consider your permanent address, you can't register there either because then you would be actually violating the law. Why? Because Abbott read the tea leaves. Just among young Latino voters, there's 300,000 young Latinos that had turned 18 since the last election. We're expecting 600,000 young Latinos in Texas. 52% of the classroom are Latino youth. When you take the African American community, the Asian community, and the Latino community in Texas, the biggest challenge there, it's these barriers to voting. It's this inability to actually access the voting booth. Texas is not a red state, it's a non-voting state. And it was because in 2020, we saw a 23% increase in the youth vote in Texas. And that scared the hell out of them. And so when we are saying we are not out of the woods, it is about organizing, actually making demands of those people at the legislature, and then being able to show receipts of what happens when you actually participate.
Now, you didn't ask what Democrats do wrong, but María just gave us what Democrats do wrong. And I'm going to double down on this conversation because it is malpractice that such a large percentage of young voters, especially voters of diverse young voters, they don't get any contact whatsoever or communications from either one of the national parties. And then, and as part of my career, I've been in this circle where Cornell young voters don't vote. Well, can't we put some money towards young voters? No, we can't put money towards because they can't vote because they don't vote. Now, the Obama campaigns put tons of money towards it and got a different turnout. But even in the data right now, in battleground congressional districts, there is a big difference. There's a gulf between the percentage of African American, Hispanic, and even AAPI voters who become a huge part of the Progressive Coalition, by the way, who are frequently getting information from either party and your baby boomer. Look, I love the baby boomers, but millennials and Gen Zs are if they as a percentage, they're potentially a larger voting bloc.
They've eclipsed it, yeah.
Yes.
As of 2020,
So
yep.
why the hell are we spending the vast majority of our money having a conversation with baby boomers? It's rhetorical.
I mean, that was sort of behind.
Well, I mean, I think part of it is that the consulting class, that is how their careers came up, is talking to these voters. So it is a condition of what you're comfortable with.
And they're all old, and they're all old guys. So you guys got to come
Mostly from the Midwest,
get
if
into
we're
the
honest,
consulting and run some of these campaigns.
Your job recruiting now?
Hence the function of the one of the call of the Holder Initiative is to get people mobilized and do this work. Greg, did you have a thought about sort of what things, you already laid out sort of why you said the red wave happened in 2020. But I mean, there is still this historic, midterm that transpired where the White House party doesn't take a beating, right? So is it essentially what you said earlier, that the wave happened and that's it, or did something else break last week?
My sense is that what Democrats did right is like not just bemoaning the structural disadvantages and just kind of throwing up their hands. I argue all the time with friends and relatives about redistricting, and yes, it's an uphill fight, but at the same time, it's like if you have a good ground game, you can overcome those. But
But should we have to overcome?
Well, I mean,
No.
as far back as politics goes,
Right.
A big part of the game is structuring it so you can win. And so this is all part, the redistricting, voter ID laws, all of this is part of,
But it bears
Democratic
heavily
tradition.
on people
No,
of
I
color, and I think that we should
No,
not
I-
accept a
I
system
agree.
where we have to jump over barriers to vote and other people get to stroll into the voting
I
booth.
think
when
that-
you
I
don't
think
have
the
the
difference-
courts,
yeah.
when you don't have the courts on your side, you have to elect individuals to fight those battles. And I'm convinced you can do that by having your ground
Mobilization.
game, having your
I think
who
they
would have
should-
thought that Georgia would be a swing state? I never thought Georgia would be a swing state in my lifetime. But my impression of what's going on there is, Stacey Abrams and her team have figured out how to change the game by getting their people to the polls. And the fact that Florida is not a swing state now, Georgia is. I think Florida definitely speaks to some of these structural disadvantages. I mean, I don't know how you're going to change things in Florida now. It's things are so
Keep
bad.
fighting.
But Georgia, for crying out loud, I mean, Georgia is now a swing state. And so I think that's evidence that, Wisconsin, look at what happened in Wisconsin. Like they were on the verge of basically making that effectively at the elite level a one-party state, even though it's very evenly divided between Republicans, Democrats, and Independents. But they stopped that, right? So they don't have their veto-proof majority. And so I think, you need to fight the battle on multiple fronts, and the critical front, in my view, is turnout, right? And that's getting people to the polls, like you were saying about 2008. I mean, that coalition, that's the Democratic coalition. They need to keep doing that, and that motivates people. That motivates young people, and so doing that kind of thing is, in my view, the Democrats' best strategy to combat what Republicans are doing by structuring the game so it favors them and skews it in their direction in unimaginable ways.
Well,
I think
one
that-
quick question. I mean, Cornell, just briefly, did you say Fetterman did not get the white working class vote?
Someone with their laptop, go to the CNN and go to Pennsylvania. No, he didn't win the majority of working class of non-college white voters. No.
Is that right?
AG, there's not a lot of Democrats who've won a majority of working class white voters in a long time in this
Since
country.
LBJ.
Yeah, a long time in this country.
I thought with the shorts, the beard, the tattoos, that
But
something
the
might
argument of the piece that I was reading, but that's just such an old, tired narrative.
But
I mean, that's what I was trying to
but
say.
I think it speaks to a place like Pennsylvania and even Georgia, is that the demographics that we're talking about are very real. In Georgia, to give you an idea, 20% of the high school is Latino. You would never guess that. Right? But I think one of the challenges is that we oftentimes hear this idea that we can just out-organize. It's getting increasingly dangerous to cast a ballot. We at Voto Latino, this is not how we started, but we had 3 weeks ago, we actually had to file with the Alliance Group, we actually had to file a lawsuit in Arizona because people were hanging out with their AK-15s in front of voting booths and taking pictures of people who were casting a ballot. That's above what someone should have to do in order to find it. And that is intimidation at the grossest level. In Texas, sadly, they basically passed a concealed carry law in April of last year, and then in quick order, they passed poll watchers that were not allowed for almost 40 years because of a law that had sunset in the 1980s. And so this is very much, we are fighting for the heart of America, and it's not just because of whether or not someone wants someone to vote and just makes it harder by cutting off voting on Saturdays. This is actually potentially dangerous, and it's those intimidations that are, I think, potentially, luckily we did not see it, but if we do not retrofit and reimagine and pass the Voting Rights Act and make sure that every single American plays by the exact same voting rules, someone is going to get hurt.
Yeah, and we can talk about organizing, and that's obviously extremely important, getting out your base, but there are also structural things. It is almost, if you do a gerrymander really well, you can't out-organize a gerrymander. I mean, that's
I'm going to write that down.
That's true. You can't. No.
And so that's a problem.
Yeah.
And that's why it's important to break down those gerrymanders.
The only thing I'll steal from Reverend Barber, he talks about the violence of being anti-democratic, and I think it's violent to have black voters in Georgia stand in line to vote for 6 hours. It doesn't require you to have shotguns or intimidation. That's one form of violence, but I think it's violence to have certain voters have to do
Poll tax.
a lot.
Such a good point.
To
and
vote,
it's
or
also
to
the
people to
reason
have to
why
pay to
you
vote.
ask yourself,
I
well, why
stole
does
it from
Georgia
Reverend
pass a
Barber.
law that says you can't give people who wait in line water or food? What kind of stupid thing is that? Well, when you create a line that's 3-4 hours long, and you say, well, you can't give them anything that might help them stay in line, that's the reason why,
So
that
I
law is
think
in existence.
with the power that we may have, we need better laws. We need Congress to act
Sure.
and provide more receipts that I think change some of the structural things and also meet people with the needs that they want. I do think we need to resolve issues of police violence. I think we do have to move forward issues with environmental justice, all of the things that people have been clamoring for. And not only do those change structures for communities, but I also think it will motivate people and bring people out to vote. But it's not enough to just keep asking people to overcome these hurdles to vote and wait for some future time where things are going to get better. I think people need to see the change now.
But let me ask this question. I mean, so just so that we don't make this seem like this is all about people of color, the largest voting bloc in this country is still white people.
Yes.
So how do...
It's for another decade.
Say again, for another decade?
Well,
Is that what you said?
it gets awfully close. Well, Maria knows that better than I, but we're getting, and the decade from now is getting close to the tipping point. It's not at a majority yet, but it's close enough. It gets awfully close in the next decade and a half.
So if you're a Democratic candidate, what is it that you do? I mean, let's turn out huge numbers of black folks, Latinos, Asian folks. What does a Democratic candidate do? You have to get a certain number of white voters in order to, and that's got to be at least, that has to be a component of a successful strategy. So,
yeah, and I don't want to be completely cynical about this because there are some changes, and I'm glad you brought that because I want to swing back around this. In 2012, we didn't win college white voters. The last two presidential races on the backs of college-educated white women, that's beginning to break Democrats. So there are some changes underneath the surface that are really important. So what happens when, and even in all the congressional races that I was working on, you know who was on the top of our targeting page? Young people, college white women, because they were very persuadable and movable. We've been doing worse, quite frankly, AG, among non-college white voters since Barack Obama. But we have been doing better, slightly better with college white women. In fact, it's actually a really important shift because again, if college white women are beginning to break 4, 5, 6 points for the Democrat, what happens? That ring around Philadelphia, that suburban ring around Philadelphia, a decade and a half ago, that was fairly red. It's now kind of purplish blue, right? So it makes Democrats more competitive in some suburban areas. And look at sort of Atlanta, for example. You know, some of these southern states, you need the magic mixture, right? You have to have a large minority population, but you have to have an upwardly mobile population, and nowhere. So that ring around Atlanta is a perfect example of that. When we won North Carolina, the triangle is a perfect example of why that is potential there, because we are now getting more competitive in suburban areas because of college-educated white voters, and listen, I didn't say this on record, but I don't think it's anything Democrats are doing. I think it's what they're rejecting from the extremism of Republicans.
I could hear you folks talk all night, but some folks have been here since 6, so I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask questions. So questions from the audience. Ask you to just keep the question, well, 1, to ask a question, and 2, to keep it as short as you can. I think, do we have a mic going around?
And we have mics over here.
Thank you so much. I love to hear everyone's thoughts. Does anyone have any predictions based off of some of the races where a Trump-backed candidate lost? Does that give us any information about 2024 if the former president does decide to run?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because I have a slew of questions about 2024, so thank you.
Well, he's announcing apparently in a couple hours.
About an hour and a half, right?
I mean, the good news is for democracy is that basically every Secretary of State that he backed in battleground states lost. And so that actually allows us to say that we're going to have fair election count in these states. It's interesting because everybody says if it's not him, it's DeSantis. But as the AG mentioned, Florida is highly gerrymandered, and it's perhaps the most under-discussed conversation of how DeSantis won. He was basically able to, he can't do that across all 50 states. So I think that what happened on this past Tuesday is that voters helped break the Trump fever. And our job now is to continue making sure that we're doing the work of passing legislation for whether it's everybody playing by the same rules. My new thing that I keep talking about is universal voting. There is great examples of other democracies like New Zealand and Australia that if everybody is meant to vote, it actually tones down the temperatures and it actually brings more people into the conversation. And that is something that we should be looking at. But I think as far as Trump, he might declare. Does he mean that he actually does it? I don't know. It could be like Teddy Roosevelt's party when he decided to break off from the Republicans, and he did that, but no one followed him. The Bull Moose Party of the last century. And there's so many parallels to the last century to this century that, yeah, sure, why not?
Though here's my issue. My issue is a primary, and I think Trump is hard to beat in a Republican primary. I'm sorry. I mean, I know that the pundit Republican class are trying to move away from him, but again, there are a lot of candidates who are just like him, who got a lot of votes, and you're talking about, and it's apples and oranges. You know, people who vote in primary is a different electorate, right? You're lucky to get half of Americans voting in a general election. You're lucky, so you're getting what, maybe a quarter vote in probably. Part of the reason why we get such extreme candidates one way or the other is you have such a narrow swath of people actually participating, and these are usually the most juiced up people about this. If he announces, he's going to be hard to beat in a Republican primary. I just think he just will, and he's already sitting on a ton of money because he's bamboozling them.
He's fleecing.
Greg, you nodded your head.
Yeah, so some of my students are in the audience, they've heard me say this before, that I summarize the Republican dilemma is they know that they can't win without Trump, but it's not clear they can win with him. And I think we have a new set of data points from this election that basically tilts the scale more toward they can't win with him. And so I agree, I don't know who, I mean, maybe DeSantis wins or can be competitive in a primary, but Trump has so much money, he's got so much name recognition, and his brand just it sells among this primary electorate. But the fact that it would be one thing if the Democrats had just sort of done okay, but the fact that all these Secretary of State candidates lost, right? These gubernatorial candidates lost, right? In places where they probably should have won in a midterm election, where the pendulum is supposed to swing back. So I think that's that's got to be really compelling evidence for those who want to. We've already seen some people trying to distance themselves from Trump, and I think we're going to see a lot more of that. But he still has a Trumpism. Even if Trump is gone, Trumpism still has a strong hold in the Republican Party. And for me, the question is, can the Republicans still win with Trumpism if they don't have Trump at the top of the ticket?
That's the million-dollar question.
And as New York's election results suggested, Trump fever has a significant following in the state, at least in certain pockets, right? In terms of what we saw with the Maloney race and others, right? I mean, there's an interesting, we mentioned Stacey Abrams' unsuccessful gubernatorial campaign in Georgia, even as she was given all sorts of credit, justifiably so, for mobilizing voters in Georgia, and yet, she wasn't able to win the governor race again. And what has transpired in New York around the crime discourse in politics is really interesting, right? Not just in terms of what happened in the recent election, but what happened with the mayoral election in this city, which, elected a Democrat, of course, but on a crime story, right? On fighting crime in the year after 2020, right? In the year after the mobilizations around police violence. That becomes the next New York mayor. So there's an interesting way in which, that's a New York story, but it's one that just merits mentioning, right? The ways in which some of the rhetoric and the particularly around crime and Trumpism does carry weight, even among people here in this state.
Although you guys got to get rid of ranked choice voting. You just got to get rid of that.
Other questions? We have many hands.
Stick or not, he goes nuts.
Freaking crazy.
Anywhere. Thanks, Mr.
Hello.
Hello.
So, zooming out a little bit, I'd like to go back to the point that America will be a majority person of color country within the next 2 or 3 decades, representing one of the biggest opportunities to make this country, in theory, more democratic than it has been in anybody's lifetime here. So my question is, why do people of color vote Democratic now? And do you think those reasons will hold true until that day?
Here's why people of color vote Democrat. Because if you look at where Latino or Hispanic, I wouldn't call them Latinx, because I've seen in polling where actually they don't want Latinx. Although you elites keep saying it's Latinx.
No, it's like, no. Let's clear this up right here.
Okay, let's clear it up.
So it's the older Latino voters, the older Latinos like, well, that's not it. But if I'm talking to a young person and they recognize that Latino doesn't adhere to the binary scale, then who am I to tell you how a young person or someone should identify? So at Voto Latino, we use Latinx and Latino. We never use Hispanic because it's very much came out of a Republican Party. It was the 1980s was the very first time that Latinos were actually included in the census, and it was Reagan that basically called us Hispanic. Yeah. And it doesn't recognize our African and Native roots of Latin America.
Because you have to base it in policy, and this is, thank you for the question, because it's an important question. But if you look at where people of color tend to be on the minimum wage, far more closer to Democrats. If you look at where they are on tax issues, far more closer to Democrats. You look at them where they are on educational issues, far more closer than to Democrats than Republicans. If you look at where they are on gun issues, right? It's funny to talk about the crime. You know who has, over the last 4 or 5 decades, been the most concerned about crime? It's been black and brown voters. But they are also among the most adamant about gun reform and having a problem with loose gun laws. So a lot more closer than they are to Democrat than Republican. So they are actually, just like every other voter, making a logical decision and choice based on their issue concerns and where the two parties are on their issue concerns. One last point on that, and thank you for that, it's such a great question. The problem is that, and after Obama won, when Michael Steele was the head of the Republican Party, they actually did the autopsy. That you all forgotten now, but they did the autopsy. And you know what they said? They said they had to go in the exact opposite direction of where Trump is actually taking them right now if they want to continue and grow as a big tent party. But Trump happened, and they've doubled down on it. Now, one last point on this is, look, you all are college students. This is a brilliant professor. You all know about the Southern strategy. As a acting, campaign political person, it's diabolical, but there's not a more successful political strategy in the history of this country, at least in modern times, than the Southern strategy. And the Southern strategy, that old dog is still kind of hunting. It's not hunting as good as it used to, but it still kind of hunts. So when you're having campaigns, and some people brought it up, when you're having campaigns about law and order right now, seems kind of reminiscent of what we know of the Southern strategy from the 1960s. A lot of it does seem awfully reminiscent to that, and when you see that polarization happening, it's intentional.
Well, I'm going to say something that might be a little controversial, but I think it's true. The Republican Party has made peace with the notion that they might not be, in terms of popular support, a majority party, that they might not win the majority of the votes. And so they want to put in place structures that will ensure their minority rule. And that means gerrymandering, where you draw the districts in such a way that, so if you look at the state as a whole after the gerrymandering is done, like in Wisconsin, pretty much a 50-50 state, and yet Republicans hold like 60% of the seats in the legislature. You engage in voter suppression tactics to keep people away from the polls. They have, substantial parts of the party have made peace with that notion that they're a political apartheid system, as long as they retain power, is something that they're going to be comfortable with.
And just for the record, consistent with that history, I would say as a nonpartisan organization that I work for,
I'm very partisan, by the way.
we have sued both parties for manipulating black voters in order to achieve power, and I think that is a constant, real probability given who's in power. Even this last election cycle, you saw an organization dedicated to Latino voting rights and Republicans on the same side of the V challenging redistricting, gerrymandering in Illinois. You see strange bedfellows often around redistricting because people want to maintain power, and they largely over history and into the present have used black voters and other voters of color as a means to maintain power. So as a nonpartisan org, I just wanted to make sure that was clear on the record that both have been guilty historically of racism in access to power.
Just to accent that point, so Nixon was, he was the strategist behind the Southern strategy, but Nixon was one of the most staunchest advocates for civil rights reform in the 1950s when he was vice president, and so Nixon was basically saying, well, we should bring this group of voters into the Republican coalition. And he saw civil rights reform, which was opposed by Democrats, well, at least Southern Democrats at the time. He saw this is the wedge that we need to pursue to split the Democratic Party, and then the Republicans will be the majority. So fast forward 15 years later or so, he is the guy who is benefiting the most from this Southern strategy, where he's like, okay, we're not forget that strategy of bringing African Americans into our coalition. We're just going straight for the white folk.
Yeah. And there were plenty of black Republicans at the time. I think Daddy King was actually Daddy King being MLK's father. Was actually, I think, back and forth with what might have been a Republican.
Jackie Robinson was a Republican.
Jackie Robinson was a Republican.
Yeah. So there was a fight for this constituency, and we know how history shows us how it played out.
But I think the alarm that you're sounding is very real. If you folks recall, we just did the 2020 census, and one of the reasons that it was tied up in the courts is that they found on our GOP strategist server, he passed away, and they found his server and literally said that the purpose of the census was to create white prominent districts. And had it not been for that receipt, everybody would have said, no, you guys are all joking. And luckily that email was actually resurfaced, and we discovered that they said the quiet part of that is that they are okay with a government that looks more like South Africa than American democracy. Mm-hmm. And I think that we are right now facing something very real. I actually believe that multiculturalism is our absolute superpower in this country. Mm-hmm. And the world knows it. And I know that the world knows it because that is why you have Russian interference in our elections, and they use racism as our Achilles heel to break us apart. And so one of the things that we're going to have to come together, and when we say that it's going to be, my daughter right now, she's in 5th grade. She is part of the alpha generation. She represents the majority minority country. There is no one that is going to be more Latino, more African American, more white, more Asian. It's like we're going to be basically equal part of this melting pot. And is it going to be in a way that is as strong as we could possibly be to lead into the 21st century? And that is what we need to be fighting for, is making sure that we have this equal access so that we actually collectively, as Americans first, lift ourselves up.
May I ask the professor a question to that point is, do we have a lot of examples of these in the Western world where you have power by one group and then they concede that power to another group peacefully?
Well, we're living that democracy, that example. We've never had this.
Well, I don't think we're in a. I don't think we're in a good road right now. If that's the case.
I don't know. I think Tuesday night showed me a good road.
There's a lot of racism type.
Well, I know what's the answer.
But no, I think it's.
Don't ask the scholar that question.
One of the strengths of American democracy has been our commitment to peaceful transitions of power. Right. And every semester when I try to motivate my Congress class, I talk about the importance of democracy for peace and prosperity, and I talk about the fundamentals of democracy. And in the abstract, I always talked about peaceful transitions of power being a keystone to democracy, and legislatures being another important factor. I mean, us experiencing an insurrection at the Capitol building to try to prevent a peaceful transition of power. It's like I never thought I'd have to have a concrete example where I would point to that to my students. And so that to me is the biggest worry. I agree that this is, there is this move now across the country to structure the rules of the game to maintain what is basically, a party that's headed toward minority status to keep themselves in power. And so, things have happened in this country. I mean, the Southerners fought like hell to preserve their institutions, but eventually the dam broke, and the Democrats parted with the Southerners, and the progressive wing parted from the Southerners, and we got civil rights reform, we got voting rights reform, and that was, there's an awful lot of violence. I don't mean to downplay that, but at the same time, it didn't lead to civil war. When a lot of people thought it might, a second civil war. There's talk of civil war now, and which is very frightening. But I've been more pessimistic than I have been about having observed what happened on January 6th about peaceful transitions of power. But I have faith that the norms and traditions of American democracy will win at the end of the day. And that's not to say there won't be violence. I mean, the poll watchers with, armed poll watchers, that's scary, right? But there are other, examples of democracy where there's actual violence at the polls, right? We haven't seen that in the United States yet, right? But that is, that's something that happens regularly in other consolidated democracies. So, when somebody asked me during election day, well, what do you think? Like, how are things going? My sort of cynical answer was, well, we haven't heard any stories about violence at the polls yet, like we might have seen in other countries.
I think we have time for maybe one or maybe two more. Let's see what we can fit in.
Thank you for joining us here tonight. Really appreciate it. So Democrats necessarily and successfully position defending democracy as the centerpiece of the midterms. Looking forward to 2024, would you say that democracy defending is the most effective political messaging for the Democrats? And how would you go about engaging an undecided voter on a topic like democracy when they may be more concerned with their children's education or the border or inflation?
It's a really good question.
So there's still undecided voters?
Yeah, I always wonder about that. After...
That's a great question.
But just quickly, I mean, when you get to that stuff, after all the campaigning's been done, all this stuff, and you get these folks that they interviewed like 2 days before the election, and they're undecided. And I'm like, what? I mean, like, you undecided? Okay. And are these the people we want to give, put our democracy in their hands? The 2 days before you can't figure it out. But I think democracy defense, reproductive rights, I think as important, that word cloud that Cornell was talking about, having that in the word cloud, I think for 24, I think it's still going to have resonance. There may be other things, 2 years is a long time, yes. But I think that those two things will stick there. And I think, unfortunately, our Supreme Court is likely to keep those two issues in some form or fashion relevant. So I think at least those two. Now, what else goes in the word cloud in 24? I don't know. I'm not
I
sure.
think that's the big X factor is 2 years is a million years in politics.
Yeah.
But I think Macron gave us an example of it, right? Macron was terribly unpopular. But the ideal of stability and versus chaos and going backwards. I think, don't say I say the French gave us a great example of how to win races in this country, willingly. But I think I think we can learn something from the race, the kind of race that Macron ran, very unpopular leader in France.
And he was facing very many the same things: high inflation. People didn't like him, and yet
they're Trump.
And they're Trump, and they're like, "Great, we don't like you. You have high inflation, yet we understand what's happening." And that was, frankly, that's one of the things that gave me hope. Was actually seeing what was happening.
Yeah, if French had fallen, France had fallen.
Then we would have been in a lot of trouble.
One more question. We have a lot of hands. I just want to give one more person a chance.
Hi, thank you all so much for being with us tonight. I had a question actually about redistricting. So I'm from Ohio, and Ohio has a very strong Republican gerrymander. In 2015 and 2018, the state passed constitutional amendments that actually make partisan gerrymandering illegal. Yet despite that, the Ohio Redistricting Commission, which is controlled by the Republicans quite strongly, has refused to redraw representative districts. My question basically is, if something like this is possible, how can we think about the future of the redistricting fight?
It's a really good question, a good observation. Just brief history, yeah. People in Ohio got together and said, we're going to amend the Constitution and ban partisan gerrymandering. Ohio's got an independent commission, and it keeps drawing these lines that are Republican gerrymanders. We've been to the Ohio Supreme Court, I think 4 times now. Ohio Supreme Court has said, this is inconsistent, it's illegal, inconsistent, it's unconstitutional. And Republicans have essentially ignored it. Now they've appealed to the Supreme Court to say that it's the independent state legislature, regardless of the courts, that ought to have the ability to draw the lines. It's a fringe theory. This is a fringe theory. This case ought to be decided 9-0. I don't think we're going to lose that case, but it shouldn't. I'll be disappointed to have a Supreme Court justice say that this independent state legislature theory is in some ways valid. But it's also disturbing to think that the Ohio Supreme Court, and it's because a Republican Chief Justice voted to say that this gerrymander is unconstitutional. Republicans just ignored an edict from their Supreme Court. And so when they talk about, lack of respect for law and order or lack of belief in our systems, that's a primary reason. If you're in Ohio, you vote for this constitutional amendment, your Supreme Court says that consistent with that amendment, you've got to take a certain course of action, and then the ruling party, and it's as represented in this commission, simply ignores. So, let's assume that they don't win the independent state legislature case before the Supreme Court. It'll be interesting to see what then do Ohio Republicans, what do they do? What does that commission in Ohio do? At some point, they've got to do that which the court tells them to do. We've been telling the court, hold these people in contempt. Start to fine them. There's got to be a mechanism by which the court enforces its orders. So we'll see.
And the only thing I'd add to that is we talked a lot about federal elections and we've talked about state legislatures, but upwards of 30 state courts across the country are elected,
right.
And people do not know enough about judicial elections where money floods them, and you have, outsized representation of a small segment of people electing people to serve on these state courts. And most litigation, most issues that are disputed go to state court. They don't go to federal court. So I think we're leaving a lot on the table when we do not know, we do not educate people about our state courts, how people get elected, how people get appointed, and we're not in the room when those decisions are made. I think that's true of secretaries of state. You know, everybody wants to be the governor, everybody wants to be, you know, the fancy positions, but secretaries of states in these other positions hold power. And so when parties are thinking about what they can do, I think we need money and education and support around all these other positions on the ticket that actually matter to people's lives, which is why we focus not just on redistricting for these state courts, but what about what happens to your city councils, county commissions, school boards. There's just all this power that we're leaving on the table in our discourse around elections.
Well, that's really interesting because go to the Ohio question. In North Carolina as well. I mean, you got the North Carolina Supreme Court to throw out a gerrymander. North Carolina Supreme Court has now been reconstituted. It was 4-3 Democratic, now it's 5-2 Republican as a result of these past elections. The Ohio Supreme Court, that Chief Justice Republican who sided with the Democrats and said, you got to redraw the lines, has now left, replaced by another Republican. And it may be that this new iteration of the Ohio Supreme Court somehow, I mean, I don't know, somehow says that what this commission is doing is consistent with the you know, that constitutional amendment. You know, we'll see. But state Supreme Court races, secretaries of state in Ohio, the state auditor plays a role in you know, in redistricting. So all of these things are important.
Well, there's so much more to say, but I do want to end with the words of a historian. I'm a historian, so I have to do this. The great historian of social movements in African American history, Robin D.G. Kelly, did an interview in the Boston Review reflecting on the midterms. And I just want to end with his words in light of the things we were just saying. He said, fascism is still a threat, despite some very important global victories, including the victory of Lula in Brazil, for example. Fascism never disappears because people come to their senses. It must be resisted and defeated. Now, you can still debate whether or not fascism is encroaching in our society, but there is this whole notion of continual struggle to defeat the forces that undermine democracy. And that's what I hear, at the very least, in his comments. And I want to leave you with that. I want to thank our distinguished panelists, Eric Holder, María Teresa, Cornell, Leah, and of course, Professor Wawro. I want to thank you all for coming, and looking forward to see you at our next Holder Initiative events. Thank you so much.